back with another KrakCast profile. We've done people from the world of politics. We've done people from the world of sports. Now we're going to turn to culture and the arts. And what better place to start than with Fryderyk Chopin, icon not only of Polish music, but really the larger world community of classical composers. Before we jump into his music and his significance as a specifically Polish composer, Josh, why don't we start with kind of the broad outline of his biography? Take us through the important steps of his life as a person, independent of his music.
Okay, well, he was born in what was then the Duchy of Warsaw in 1810, the son of a Frenchman who was originally from Lorraine in France and a Polish woman, and his born name was Fryderyk Franciszek Chopin. He exhibited some kind of. This was a bourgeois family.
Yeah, this is a family of means.
I mean, they weren't in that. They certainly weren't at the highest level. They weren't aristocracy, but they were connected, and they were, let's say, a good family. He exhibited some kind of talent for music at a very early age. He was initially taught by his mother, but by the age of 6, he was getting lessons from the Czech-born pianist, violinist, and composer Wojciech Żywny.
Was this prodigy level or not quite?
This is very much prodigy level.
Kind of like Mozart, yeah?
I mean, I think Mozart kind of edges him just in terms of sheer precocity.
But Mozart also from a fairly well-off family as well, I think.
Yeah. Well, I mean, also Mozart's father, Leopold, was an established composer in his own right. In fact, I mean, had the younger Mozart not become famous, then his father would have been the most famous Mozart.
Do you think, can I ask you, just to take a step away from the biography for a second, you hear this word prodigy used quite a bit in the world of music, and not coincidentally, I think it's very frequently in the context of a family with the financial means to provide a very good musical education. Now, I don't know. What do you think about the idea of having this innate talent for music, just being born with it, as opposed to being in a context or an environment that kind of nurtures it and develops it?
Well, I suppose I'm in the certainly not the unique position, but I am in a position to comment quite kind of accurately in terms of this, because I actually started having piano lessons just after my 5th birthday, and I did not give my first public performance at age 7. I did not release my first compositions out to an eager, awaiting world by the age of 8 or 9. And I wasn't taken under the wing of a famous pianist and composer from one of the major conservatoires. So, it is possible to have all of these opportunities made available to one and not turn out to be another Mozart or Chopin.
Do you believe in the idea of having this natural God-given talent?
Yes, I absolutely do, because I think that it's one of these things that if the raw materials aren't there to begin with, then you're not going to be able to do anything with them. It then has to be added to that of course, if nobody knows that those raw materials are there, then if they're not developed and brought out, they won't be.
Do you think someone, for example, like me, who has literally zero musical talent, no matter how hard I practice, I'm never really going to go anywhere because the talent just isn't there? Is that what you mean?
I think that especially in terms of something like playing classical concert piano, then absolutely not, because the very highest heights of ability are achieved by people. I mean, people who are barely not even really normal human beings. I probably don't keep up quite so much with what's going on in the classical world nowadays, but I mean, they're young piano players who say, for example, win the oldest and most recognized piano competition in the world, which is the Chopin Warsaw.
Right. It's like every 5 years, I think.
Yeah, but it is the most prestigious. And I mean, one of the interesting things, I was going to mention this later on, but now seems an appropriate opportunity.
Okay.
One of the things about the Chopin piano competition is that not every winner goes on to achieve great things, but nearly every piano player who has gone on to achieve great things in the last 100 years, or slightly less, has been highly placed in the Warsaw Chopin.
There's a correlation there.
You get to be there in the first place.
Let's go back to Chopin's biography. Now, as with so many other people of that period of time, at some point, his life became severely affected by larger political wins that took his life in a completely new direction?
Well, I mean, he'd kind of... Okay, well, actually, I first wanted to make the point because I maybe didn't establish this clearly enough that... I mean, he was giving his first performances at age 7, and these public performances, and his first and of his own compositions in some cases at the age of 7. We don't have any surviving compositions until he reached the age of 11. But it's worth pointing out that he was very much on the map and noticed as someone of really startling and prodigious ability. How
many 7-year-olds do you know today who can write a piano composition of any quality?
Well, yeah. What you have is by the time he's in his teens, he is already, shall we say, being kind of hothoused into being a concert pianist and composer at the very highest level. His teachers are amongst the very best. He's kind of in Warsaw, and then he has kind of health issues, and there is a political situation, and they decide to leave Poland, he ultimately ends up in Paris at the age of 21, and he was never to return. He never returned to Poland, in fact.
So he died when he was 39, getting slightly ahead of things, but he died at the age of 39, spent just over half of his life, the first half of his life in Poland, never to return, still became an icon of the Polish music scene, which we'll come back to in a minute, I suppose. So in Paris, obviously he comes into contact with an entire world of renowned musical and artistic talent.
Well, absolutely. I mean, I think at this time, in the broader kind of, I don't know, like should we say, time frame of classical music, this was the kind of bridge point between the classical era, which had maybe been established by, like a few decades earlier, were the likes of Beethoven, Mozart, Haydn, and so on, Schubert. And, Chopin's the great kind of... should we say, proponent of what now is known as the Romantic era within classical music, which would kind of continue for another 100 years or so, kind of, I suppose, culminating with people like Rachmaninoff and so on in the early mid-20th century. But this time in Paris there was a sort of flourishing of the arts. There were the famous salons. I mean, one of the very interesting things about Chopin, in fact, is that in his adult life, he gave barely more than 30 concerts. This was at a time, of course, where you weren't on the radio or making records because the technology didn't exist. He made most of his money from selling copies of his music for other people to play, from giving piano lessons for which he charged.
Sorry. Would a public performance consist of like a proper concert hall, or would that include a small audience in a salon?
Well, it would. By this I mean a proper concert hall. But no, in fact, what he did, the majority of his performances were, shall we say, private salons in someone's admittedly quite large house.
Very limited audience then.
But yeah, and he would, and he was kind of, because he had kind of tuberculosis and he was rather kind of wasted appearance. So he was a kind of prototype for the sort of, elegantly wasted rock star of more recent times. There was kind of, stories about, ladies fainting, swooning at the sound of his kind of mellifluous playing.
Yeah, he had kind of a slight exaggeration, but he had kind of a tabloid aspect to his life before there were tabloids.
Well, it's kind of interesting because he wasn't alone at this period of time or in this kind of aspect, because there was a couple of competitors to this particular crown, one being Niccolo Paganini, the famous kind of Italian solo violinist who, was rumored to be possessed by the devil, and sparks flew from his fingertips as he was
quite a rumor.
And he was a kind of dark character, and of course Franz Liszt, who was kind of a contemporary of Chopin but lived to be rather older, who was a phenomenally virtuosic piano player, and the two enjoyed a somewhat uneasy friendship for many years until not long before Chopin's death. And I think there was a sense that, Liszt maybe edged him slightly in terms of pure piano playing technique, but we really are talking right at the margins here. But Chopin was had the edge in terms of composition.
All right, we're going to talk about the music in just a minute, but before we do, let's complete the bio, Dr. Mike, with an examination of his death. As Josh has mentioned a couple of times, Chopin plagued by health issues for most of his life, and there's a bit of uncertainty and speculation about exactly what he died from, and even today we're not completely sure. Tuberculosis is one of the options, but it's not the only one. Can you take us through how he may have or probably died?
I mean, it is a safe bet to say that tuberculosis was the cause of his death. At that time, it could not be treated. He had no antibiotics, no kind of possibility of sustaining somebody who was seriously ill. Tuberculosis, a lot of people don't realize, it's not just the lungs, but it infects the entire system. It's often known for hitting the liver, the kidneys, the entire nervous system. It can kill you 1,000 ways, not just by coughing up blood. He was diagnosed years before he died. He was sent off, for instance, to Mallorca to be treated because, they thought back then that, better air quality, drier air or sea air, heat was treated. Fortunately, that wasn't the case. Apparently, the weather was very bad when he was there, and his condition deteriorated quite quickly after that. His cause of death is usually listed not only as tuberculosis as pericarditis, but
what's that?
Basically, it just means inflammation of the heart, just to put it quite bluntly, which can be caused by anything. But in this case, it's most likely tuberculosis.
No, wait, it seems like tuberculosis in the lungs and the heart is two totally different issues, no?
Well, actually, the lungs and the heart are, cardiovascular system. They're quite connected. And
damn you with your medical knowledge.
Yeah, finally it pays off, I get to. And the heart just, if it was finally that his heart just couldn't stand the pressure anymore, or his lungs, it doesn't really matter. It's safe to say that tuberculosis killed him. The exact mechanism that finished him off, it can be debated, but I would say it was definitely TB. Something that nowadays we can treat, or unless you're coming in from Russia, where they have the antibiotic kind of resistant strains.
Speaking of his heart, his heart is entombed, if that's the right word, in a church in Warsaw, but the rest of him is in the Père Lachaise famous cemetery in Paris.
It just seems like a freaky thing to do, like a very occult thing.
It's weird. Part of you here, part of you there. All right, well, let's return to the music, which is, of course, the main thing for which he's known. Josh, I'm going to try to sound semi-intelligent in this discussion. I'll, of course, defer to you on all things music. Plenty of people have composed for the piano, but here we are 170 years after his death, and we're still talking about Chopin as kind of one of the masters of compositions for the piano. What is it about his music that kind of separates him from so many others?
Well, I think that there's a lot of things to say really about him. One of the things that possibly is notable about Chopin, especially in the context that he really is, if he's not at the very top level of world famous classical composers, the level of, say, Bach, Beethoven, and Mozart, for example, he's, in that select grouping not very far behind. He really is one of the most widely known composers. And what's possibly unique about him is that every single piece of music that he wrote was for the piano, and in most cases it was for solo piano, and with the exception of a couple of piano concertos and some sonatas with cello or with violin and cello, and some songs. Nearly everything that he wrote was solely for the piano, and everything he wrote did include the piano.
Okay, quick question, maybe a stupid question. Does the fact that he only wrote for piano in any way diminish his credibility as a composer?
Well, that's a good question. And I mean, I suppose you could look at other instruments and say, he only wrote for the clarinet. Does that in any way? Or the banjo, or, the...
Banjo composer would be awesome.
Yes, I thought that would appeal.
Thank you.
But in a sense, it's to recognize the kind of the unchallengeable superiority of the piano as a musical instrument over all others, because it is the one in which you can cover the entire range of what we can appreciate musically. The highest notes on the piano are really the highest notes that make any musical sense, and similarly with the lowest notes, yes, you can hear higher and you can hear lower, but it's very hard to make it musically coherent. You can use all 10 fingers, and I suppose if you're Jerry Lee Lewis, your feet as well, to kind of create, incredibly complex chords. You can have rhythms going on in one hand and melodies taking place in the other hand, and vice versa. So, yes, if there is going to be an instrument that has kind of, this kind of like place on the top of the pile, then it's going to be the piano. And I suspect that if you ask anybody who was the most kind of noteworthy composer for the piano, once you put aside maybe Johann Sebastian Bach, who composed some of the greatest pieces that we know on the piano, but he didn't compose them for the piano as we know it now. When Chopin was flourishing, was at the beginning times of what we now know as the modern piano. And in fact, towards the end of his life, when he spent some time in London, he was on very good terms with John Broadwood, who was one of the original British manufacturers of the first modern grand pianos.
We can kind of group or segment his compositions into a few categories. And the names.
I know you want to say genre, but
no, they're not genres. They're kind of categories. And the names of those categories.
Reggae and his country.
No, not those. His banjo era. No, but no. But and the names of those categories are kind of familiar: mazurkas and polonaises and nocturnes and whatnot. Take us through those and take us through kind of the characteristics that kind of define each of those categories and kind of what separates one from the other.
Well, okay. I mean, I think one of the things that is kind of a particular recognizable feature of, say, classical music or organized classical music is that composers and orchestras tend to arrange things in certain kind of style. There are things have names and they have reasons for them. There are things called sonatas which they take a sonata form and they have movements, and there are structures to these things, and similarly, there are types of pieces that have a reason for being called that type of piece. So, for example, Chopin did 24 preludes. Well, actually, he did 26, but the initial 24 was something that was derived from the idea of what Bach did of his 24 preludes. There are 12 notes in the Western diatonic scale, and if you include major keys and minor keys, that gives you 24. So the idea was that you 24 preludes and you cycle through the entire 12-tone scale with one prelude in each of the keys in both major and minor, which gives you 24. So those are preludes.
Yeah, just go with it, Mike. I'm with you, but okay.
Yeah. No, mathematically it makes sense. I mean,
totally.
Now, he also did kind of, shall we say, books of other styles of pieces. I'm going to get onto the mazurkas and polonaises a little bit later because that kind of specifically addresses the Polishness of what Chopin.
It's a 20-minute show, Josh.
Yeah. Okay.
You need a shot of Chopin vodka right now.
So, but I think for those people who perhaps don't necessarily enjoy classical piano very much, but maybe kind of get off on what we might call like the fireworks or the pyrotechnics of when somebody is just playing a ridiculously fast number of notes very, very quickly, then I recommend that you check out his etudes, which were kind of challenges really to the pianists of the day.
They're like an exercise, aren't they?
Well, I think exercise is one way of saying it, but it kind of misses.
Challenge. Okay.
You want to go, if you want to listen to Chopin's etudes, you want to go to the very, very finest and most kind of, shall we say, gymnastically equipped fingers, the pianists that are available. His
nocturnes, if that's the right word.
Well, those are generally speaking, the nocturnes are kind of slower and more lyrical.
Well, they are, and let me just a quick question about those, and maybe this applies to another of his categories as well, but certainly the nocturnes. I don't know if it's in the composition or the performance, but there's a delicateness, there's a sensitivity and a softness that kind of characterizes a Chopin composition, and to my ears anyway. Am I imagining something, or is that one of his signatures?
I think that's very, very true. I mean, okay, so, this is by kind of contrast to the etudes, which are very much kind of crash bang dynamics, very fast notes, and can often be very loud or fortissimo, as we musicians like to say. But the nocturnes tend to be far more lyrical. And I think I don't want to get too much into kind of technical musical terms, but
we don't want you to either.
No, right. But there's a term which you will hear a lot if you ever listen to classical radio or reviews of classical music, which is rubato. And rubato, like most musical terms, is Italian. And it means kind of, taking away. And the sense is that if there is a tempo, you have to understand that classical music doesn't have, like John Bonham at the back banging out a straight 4/4, which the whole band must keep in time with. Like classical music is about an ebb and flow. Sometimes it gets faster, sometimes it gets slower. And lyrical music, like a lot of Chopin's is, it's very possible that you can kind of speed up in certain parts and then slow down in others, like wringing the emotion out of the music. And
but take the foot off the gas.
And I mean, there are some kind of like somewhat more ham-fisted pianists who kind of over-egg the pudding, if you like, and kind of really milk this. And there are others that have, a proper sense of what the music is about. Possibly one of the most famous of Chopin's nocturnes is the number 20 in C-sharp minor, which is featured twice in the film The Pianist, at the beginning and at the end, when he somehow kind of implausibly manages to play it without mistake after not touching a piano after 5 years in isolation.
I call bullshit.
I was a little dubious about that one, but, we don't know. But, I mean, if you listen to this piece, and I really, if there's one piece of Chopin that you might already recognize and that if you don't know anything about him, you might want to check out. It's pretty kind of easygoing. And as it starts, if you're trying to counter 1, 2, 3, it will not stay on that pulse because it kind of goes faster and then it goes. There's a kind of a push and pull to it that kind of, I mean, the notes are deliberately chosen to have an emotional effect, shall we say, but the pace and timing of it also does.
Let me jump to mazurkas and polonaises, and both of those very closely associated with Polish culture, and in fact, both of those words have roots in something to do with Poland. Tell us what mazurkas and polonaises are and their similarities and just their musical kind of origins.
Well, at their basis, they're both kind of dance motifs. The Polonaise had already been in existence as a classical musical form. There are other composers had worked with the rhythmic structure and had done tunes that had been kind of like drawn from Polish folk melodies.
What's the tempo of this polonaise?
Well, both polonaises and mazurkas, it's a kind of variation on the waltz theme. So if you like, it's what's known as 3/4 time. In normal musical terms, and that means that like with a waltz you have it's like 1 2 3 2 2 3 3 2 3 1 2. So the emphasis is on the first beat, but it is 3 equal beats per bar. Now, what you had with the mazurka was a little kind of embroidery to this. So it was like bum ba dum bum bum ba dum bum, a little skip in there.
So they're very similar but still distinct.
Yeah, and I mean you could dance a waltz to a mazurka, and you could dance a mazurka to a band playing a waltz. Although we're not just talking about the rhythm, also there's the timing there. And something about Chopin's mazurkas is that generally they were played a little faster than you would actually dance to them, because he wasn't playing them for you to dance to. He was taking a dance form, a rhythmic form, and applying a kind of a melodic and harmonic sensibility to that. But it was that with the originally the form was mazurek, and he entitled his pieces mazurkas. And I suppose perhaps from a Polish perspective, they're arguably, and he wrote a lot of mazurkas as well. I mean, huge number of. I mean, maybe the greatest number of single compositions within his entire kind of output.
A lot of composers have a signature sound. Like I think of, I don't know, Vivaldi in a violin quartet, or like a very strong Rachmaninoff piano chord or something like that. Does Chopin have a signature sound that immediately identifies his piece of music?
Yes, he absolutely does. Unfortunately, there's, the only way I can try to explain that is either by using kind of like strictly musical theory terms, which will only make sense to people who understand music
talk down
theory.
to us,
and they'll already know that anyway. Or I kind of, and I'm not kind of sufficiently confident in my abilities on the keyboard to turn around and try and bash something out on the piano behind me. But there's a thing where it's kind of it's like a falling and then rising cadence, which is like, if you like, a shift between two notes, and he goes like ba 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 da ba da ba da da ba ba dum ba dum.
It's a melodic quality,
and this is, I mean, for sure, once you're familiar with, say, a handful of Chopin's most well-known works, then you will start to become familiar with some of his melodic motifs. You will find them in other people's music. You will occasionally find them in people who preceded him, like notably Schubert, who is one of the few composers for the piano who I think kind of comes close to matching Chopin in terms of melodic.
He was so good, he influenced people before him.
Well, no, but
that's impressive. That's skills.
To say that
mad skills.
I mean, it doesn't seem that that Chopin widely acknowledged Schubert as an influence, but you can definitely hear, or at least there are compositions by Schubert that Chopin couldn't have heard because he hadn't been born yet. And similarly, of course, with Franz Liszt, Chopin's great contemporary, there's a lot in there that you can recognize, and even going into the 20th century with lesser composers like Szymanowski and Arensky and Rachmaninoff.
Wow, call somebody a lesser composer. It's a backhanded compliment, I think.
Well, I mean, the fact
you're okay. You're not as good as him, but you're okay.
You're kind of like a genius, but a slow genius.
Chopin-ish.
You can kind of diss Szymanowski for not being Chopin, but for a guy who died 100 years ago, the fact that you can buy CDs with him now suggests that he has some kind of staying power.
Let's transition here to kind of Chopin's place in Polish culture and among the giants of Polish music. Obviously, as I said, he died before his 40th birthday. Spent half of his life, more or less, outside of the second half, the more productive, I guess, musically part of his life outside of the country. How did he become so closely woven with the fabric of Polish identity and Polish nationalism?
I think that's an extremely good question, and on the surface, it doesn't really seem to make sense. Although, according to many sources, he never, despite the fact that his father was French.
On top of everything else, half of his family is not Polish.
His early years were in Poland. He grew up speaking Polish. He knew how to speak French. Apparently, by all accounts, suggest that even all the years that he lived in Paris, he wasn't super comfortable speaking French. He was always happier speaking Polish. He felt a great sense of regret that he hadn't been around for the November uprising, although I can't see really how he would have influenced it in any way. And, probably better for him that he
played the background music when people were shooting each other. Yeah,
probably better for him that he got away. But the understanding is that he, far more than identifying as French, he identified as Polish, and in a sense, I think the body of his work, the bulk of his work, kind of emphasizes that. There is very little that is. That points to a French influence in his work, whereas if there are kind of like melodic and harmonic motifs, they are more connected with, if not directly with Poland, with the central kind of European region.
We're getting into deeper water here, Dr. Mike, but I'll just throw this out there, see what you think. Chopin born 15 years after the last partition, Poland wiped away from the map. Poland didn't exist as a nation when he was born. There was no Poland for his entire lifetime. Is there some connection between the desire to preserve what was there, like the mazurkas, like the polonaises, all kind of cultural artifacts, try to preserve the nation in the form of music when it didn't really exist on the map? Does that make any sense?
It does, and it was definitely during this time when the concept of nationhood in Europe in general started to really sprout. So the fact that they Poles didn't have a geographical like nation with boundaries and borders and capitals. Didn't mean they didn't have an identity or even an ethnic kind of group at that time. And culture is a major part of any identity of any type of nation. And as these ideas started to grow, a lot of people felt that, and Chopin was one of those people. And a lot of people took that in as well with their culture, with the romanticism of that time as well. This emotional type of poetry and art that started to sprout really in the early and later 19th century. You had your Mickiewicz, who was also quite noted for talking about Chopin as well. This all built it into this kind of national identity that didn't really explode until, almost a century later when Poland was reborn. But it kept Poles as an identity going through this time when they didn't actually have a physical country to call their own. So it was definitely very important.
Josh, Chopin, without question, the greatest Polish composer ever?
Without question, yes.
Okay.
And one of the greatest classical composers ever.
Everyone else is a lesser composer, I guess, right? Is that what you call them? Lesser? Szymanowski?
You're throwing my words.
I am.
Yeah. Right then. Okay.
Well, there you have it, Fryderyk Chopin, ladies and gentlemen. We'll be back with another profile. I'm not sure who else we're going to talk about from the world of Polish arts and letters and culture and things like that. We'll think of somebody, I'm sure. Don't forget to go to our website, KrakCast.pl. All of our back episodes are there, almost 190 episodes now. The donate button is there as well. So if you enjoy our show and if you want to support the show, that's how you can do it. Click the donate button. It'll take you to PayPal, and you know how to do the rest after that. Thanks again, everybody, and we'll see you next time on the KrakCast.